I'm a clinical scientist. I work in the area of genetic disease in humans, and essentially what my job is to look at the DNA of people who are ill and compare that DNA to a normal DNA sequence and try and work out if we can find a change that actually explains why that person's ill.
Thank you very much. Krista, what about you?
Yeah, so I work in research at the moment. So my interest is particularly in bacterial infection and immunity, and in particular metabolism. So immunity and metabolism are actually very connected processes. So some of you probably had experience of that. If you get infected, you lose your appetite. We all know it. So what I've been trying to do is work out how a small subsection of metabolism is able to support the immune response. And obviously, they don't let you experiment on humans most of the time. So I've been using a model organism called the fruit fly. I've brought some here today. So flies make a great model for lots of reasons. They're small, they reproduce very fast, loads of genetic tools to manipulate the genome. And importantly, there's actually quite a lot of conservation between the human genome and the fly genome. So
yes, we don't find that particularly reassuring, I have to tell you. Yeah.
You look different.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you for that.
But yeah, 75% of disease genes are the same in flies. So hopefully what we learn from the fly is useful for us.
And I think you told me at some point that you inject these dear little things.
Yeah, the poor flies, they go through a lot. But it takes quite a steady hand to inject them with bacteria and then manipulate them and see how quick they die. So it's an interesting life.
Great. Let's.
They're going away.
Well, I'm going to come to you again in a moment, Nathalie. But I mean, people say genetics is right at the front edge of science today. Can you explain, why that is the case?
Yeah. So I think on two fronts. So firstly, so much of human disease is actually rooted in genetics. So cancer is caused by genetic mutation, antibiotic resistance is caused by genetic mutation. So actually, the more we can understand the genome, the better we can develop treatments. But then secondly, I think it's also at the forefront because of all the technological advancement. So in 2012, we saw the introduction of something called CRISPR, and that's a technique that enables the genome to be mutated really specifically and really easily. So that means in the last 10 years, we've been able to, mutate the genome super easily, look at gene function much better. And we've come a long way in sequencing, and that means we just have access to far more genetic code, genetic information than we've ever had before.
And your particular area was very key, wasn't it, in terms of the pandemic and so forth? I mean, you especially, but genetics was important to that, I guess, in terms of developing the antivirus and all that sort of thing.
Yeah, exactly. So, genetic genes are what encode proteins, and so it was actually genetic code that, for the first time, formed the vaccines. So we all had mRNA vaccines, which are genetic rather than protein, which was a huge step.
Fascinating. Now, Nathalie, your research, I'm sorry to make that elementary mistake, but your research was in the area of poppy pollen and self-incompatibility.
Yes.
Just expand on that a little bit for us.
Yes. So I started out in plants, and then I've later moved over to humans. It was quite a niche PhD. So I was basically trying to find the male genetic component in poppy pollen, because some plants have developed this mechanism called self-incompatibility, which is when pollen, which is the male component, lands on the stigma in the flower, which is the female component, and they essentially work like a lock and key mechanism. So if pollen from the same plant or a genetically identical plant lands on the stigma, this lock and key mechanism recognises that, and it essentially triggers a really complex series of reactions in the pollen that essentially tells it to die so that it can't pollinate. Whereas if pollen from a different plant lands on the stigma, that lock and key mechanism recognises it as different, and so it can go on to pollinate. So the female genetic component had already been found, and then my PhD was to try and find that male component, which thankfully we did manage to find, and then managed to publish quite a nice paper out of it too.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah.
When we were, was any of this to do with kind of genetic modification of plants? We haven't got sort of tomatoes
People did
the
ask
size
that
of
at the time.
houses.
Unfortunately not. The research wasn't quite that groundbreaking.
Okay, fine. Now, I think so far most of us have probably been able to follow. There will be a number of people here who are in kind of your sort of fields. Could you give us a more technical description of what it is your research was in and what you're doing now?
So the research, kind of, that's been explained. In terms of the diagnostics that I now work in, essentially there's a lot of genetic disorders. So if people who are ill go to a doctor and the doctor suspects that they've got a genetic disorder, they would get referred to specialists. And usually you'd get to see a clinical geneticist who would request genetic testing, which then means you either have a blood sample taken or a saliva sample taken, and DNA would be extracted from that and then sequenced, which is where I come in. And essentially what happens is the patient's DNA is, their whole genome is aligned against a reference genome, which is essentially like a normal genome. And my job is to try and work out what difference might be in that DNA that is causing disease. And what's tricky about that is that there are thousands of variations between any two genomes. So between ours, and everyone in this room, there'll be thousands and thousands of variations. And a lot of those are just natural variation, which obviously aren't having any detrimental effect on our well-being. But that's different in a patient who's got a genetic disorder. So we can't really closely interrogate thousands. So the first part of the job is to try and filter down from those thousands into a more manageable number. And we do that by looking at how common the variant is in the general population, where it is in the genome, what kind of effect it's having on the protein, and quite a lot of other things I won't go into too much detail about. But then we basically get down to a manageable number, so hopefully in the region of 10 to 50. And we then basically try to find we look at them much more closely and try to find evidence to basically separate those variants into either benign, so variants that are not disease-causing, or variants that actually are likely to be disease-causing and therefore explain the reason why the patient's ill. So what we then want to do is condense all that into an understandable format that we write a report that goes back to the doctor that then gets communicated with the patient.
That's wonderfully clear, and even I could follow it. So, but you have, it was just worth, I think, me saying that, because you're in diagnostics, you only take and research on somebody who's been referred to by a GP or a doctor.
Yes, yeah. I won't be able to look at any of your DNA.
No, that's helpful to get that clear. Now, Krista, for the more technically minded, just a technical description of what your area is.
Yes, so I started my PhD looking for genes that are upregulated during infection, and two came out that I was particularly interested in, involved in amino acid and folate metabolism. And one's got an excellent name. It's called NAD-dependent methylene tetrahydrofolate dehydrogenase cyclohydrolase. It's catchy. And so since I found that those are...
Can you just say that again slowly? Just say it slowly so we can really revel in it.
It's called NAD-dependent methylene tetrahydrofolate dehydrogenase cyclohydrolase.
Splendid.
Or NMDMC for short.
Thank you.
So then I was trying to work out... characterize these genes in the immune response. So partly thinking, how are they upregulated? What are the signaling pathways and transcription factors that drive their expression? And then also thinking partly, do they actually contribute anything useful to immunity? So using RNAi knockdowns, making CRISPR mutants, and studying the immune competency of these flies lacking the expression of these genes.
Thank you so much, Chris, as clear as a bell. Nathalie, Nathalie, our evening, we're thinking about the origins of life. Can I believe in God? We're going to come on to Christianity and science in a moment, but both of you are clear followers of the Lord Jesus, and I thought it'd be nice to get a bit of the backstory. How did you come to follow Jesus for yourself?
So I started out not having any clue about Christianity. So I grew up with my mum and my twin sister. We never went to church. We never read the Bible. As far as I'm aware, there wasn't even a Bible in our house. But when my granddad died, when me and my sister were 10, I think that was the first thing that started getting us asking some of the bigger questions in life. So, was there a God? What's the point in life? Why are we here? What happens when we die? And I think at age 10, we had a lot of questions and no answers. And then I'd say over the next 6 years or so, God brought different Christians into our lives. And I was interested enough to kind of half-heartedly investigate the Christian faith, but I would say it was very half-hearted. And if I'm honest, I'd kind of come to the conclusion that Christianity seemed a little bit weird. So I was kind of quite happy to keep it at arm's length. But God had different ideas, because when me and my sister got to college, we met some more persistent Christians who kept saying to us, we come along to church or come along to the Christian Union, and which our standard response for a long time was, no thanks, been there, done that, thought it was all a bit weird. But my sister did, she caved in first. She started going along to church to a series of evenings, which was a little bit like this, kind of designed for people who are wanting to explore a bit more about the Christian faith. And she became a Christian, which was a really big deal for me because we're identical twins. We'd done pretty much everything the same in life up until that point. And she definitely changed in a good way. And she, I guess, had some of the answers to the questions we'd been asking since we were 10. And so when she and a few of our friends from the church said to me, would you consider going on a Christianity Explored course? I kind of semi-reluctantly agreed to go, but I was, by that point, really interested to know a bit more. So a Christianity Explored course does what it says on the tin, and it's a really great opportunity to explore the Christian faith more in smaller groups where you get to ask any questions that you have. And it was only when I got there that I realised that even though I'd had interaction with Christians for 6 or so years, I really didn't have a clue what the Christian message was, and I didn't know what the basics of the Bible was, and even things like God created the world and that mankind turned his back on God, and that God's actually provided the solution, sending Jesus, for that relationship to be restored. And the more that I looked into Christianity, the more that I realised actually the evidence for Jesus being who he says he is really compelling. And actually, as I looked at the world around me, I thought, actually, the Bible does make sense of the world around me. And looking back, I don't have a light bulb moment when I can define that I became a Christian, but I definitely, over a period of time, realised that if God was real, and I'd definitely come to the conclusion by then that he was, that I'd actually been living in his world for 18 years and enjoying all his good things, but completely ignoring him. And I realised I just couldn't continue to do that anymore. So I turned back to him and asked for forgiveness and asked for help to live following him. And that was over 20 years ago.
Thank you, Natalie. Is there anything specific that particularly attracted you to the person of Jesus Christ that you can think of?
I think there's so many things, but the unconditional love he offers to people, and he's so different to all of us. He's sinless, and I think, if we look inside of ourselves, I wouldn't imagine, I certainly can't, that no one here can say that they can go through even a whole day without thinking something wrong or acting in a way that you regret. And you look at the person of Jesus, and he was perfect, and actually he loves us enough that he came to die for us, which I think is just an amazing fact that no one else here would be able to do for each other.
Thank you, Natalie. So now, Krista, your story is slightly different because you came from a home which was Christian. And so how did you come to make your parents, grandparents' faith your own?
So I grew up in a Christian home. But I think, as a teenager, I did have my questions. Christianity sounded a bit wacky. And particularly someone I was close to, respected Christianly, walked away, said they thought it was all a fairy tale. So that did really get me thinking, is it true or isn't it? But a couple of things kind of bolstered my faith in those years. So one of them, a friend invited me to a youth group at another church, which was particularly good at Bible teaching, encouraged me to read the Bible for myself. And I found that the Bible wasn't just this kind of collection of random crazy Old Testament stories and nice sayings by Jesus, but that actually it's this really deep and profound work that's written over hundreds of years by many, many authors, and yet comes together to tell a really compelling story about why the world is the way it is, what God's plans are for the world. So yeah, I found that actually I loved reading the Bible, found it read like something really special. But then secondly, I think, in my later teenage years, I kind of realized that Christianity all stands or falls on Jesus. Did he live, die, and rise? So unlike other religions, it's actually historically falsifiable. So I began to look into some of the evidence for the reliability of the New Testament, and was actually really blown away by what I found. So if you compare the New Testament to other texts from the time that we just accept in history, we get taught in schools, the New Testament is the same, if not better, in terms of the time span between the events and the events being recorded, better in terms of the time span between the events being recorded, our first physical copies, far many more actual manuscripts that we can cross-check for differences. And if you leave the Bible out of it, there's also tons of Roman, Jewish, different sources that attest to things in the New Testament. So I became convinced that Jesus really did live and die. And then, for me, the best explanation of what happened in the first century, the expansion of the early church, is that Jesus also really did rise.
So very evident. I mean, it's striking, isn't it? Very, you can see your mind working it all through. Yeah. Just, we'll stay with you, I think, for a moment and say, now, the big issue that we come to think about, Christianity and science, so many people, you hear it said they're just not compatible, and yet here you both are, you're clearly at the top of your game, and yet you're Christians, and so how do you answer? I mean, if I come to you and say, look, Christianity and science, they're just completely incompatible, how do you answer that?
Yeah, so I think normally when I have this conversation, there are two key aspects that people see as opposition. So the first one being creation, the idea that science has disproven the Bible's narrative in Genesis about how the world was made. And for me, that's not really a big deal. So actually, for me, it's more of a question of history than it is of philosophy and science, because in the Gospels, Jesus actually quotes from the book of Genesis. He talks about it as if it's scripture. So that tells me the question is really, do we have the words of Jesus? Because if we do, then we can have confidence that in some way Genesis and science reconcile. And in terms of how that happens, I don't think it's too hard. I think with any section of the Bible, you have to think, why has the author written this? What type of writing is this? And I think the main point Genesis 1 is trying to teach is that God created the world. He powerfully made it a beautiful, intricate world. And I think that's what it's trying to show, rather than being a scientific textbook. So I don't think those things are too hard to reconcile, but do grab me afterwards. Happy to chat about that. So that's one thing. But I think another thing I often hear as well is when people see biology happening in a sort of suboptimal way. So I remember once having a lecture in my degree where the lecturer said, what I'm going to show you today is very strong evidence against intelligent design. And he talked about the structure of the eye. And what he said is that if light comes into the eye in this direction, then the photoreceptors that detect the light, you would think they would face the light, but they actually face the opposite way. And he said, this disproves that a creator intelligently designed the human eye. But actually, as I was sat there, I got quite frustrated because while it's true that Genesis 1 presents this idea that God created this incredible, beautiful creation, just 2 chapters later, we see that humans actually reject God. They turn their backs on God. God is therefore rightly angry, and he actually curses the world and leaves the world kind of fallen and broken. So one of the New Testament authors describes it as, that creation is groaning, or that it's in bondage to decay. So this picture in which, creation itself is slightly broken. So I think if the Bible's narrative is correct, what we'd actually expect to see in creation is something beautiful and intricate and complex, and yet not quite perfect, slightly suboptimal. And that is exactly what I see in the world and in the lab.
Just tell me how old you were when this all was going on, Krista, because this is quite
20.
To age 20. So anyway, it's really helpful. And do grab, I mean, Nathalie and Krista very kindly said they'd be here, and so do grab them afterwards. But Nathalie, what about you? How do you answer that question, the compatibility of Christianity and science?
So obviously, similarly, I just do not have an issue with it at all. So I think my background in science and my work in genetics only reaffirms my faith in a God. So in my line of work, I'm looking at the human genome, which is made up of 3 billion letters, which all have to be precisely ordered in order to form our human bodies and for them to function normally. And in my line of work, I see the really devastating impact for just when one of those letters out of 3 billion is wrong. And so for me, that really obviously points to a creator behind that complexity and that order. And actually, I'd challenge people and ask people who are asking that question and say, actually, I think it takes more faith to believe that this earth and everything in it came about by complete chance than it does to believe that there's a God who created it. And I once heard it, I found this a really helpful explanation. Someone once said that the chance of our 3 billion letters of DNA coming together in perfectly the right order to form our complex human bodies is like a tornado sweeping through a scrapyard and forming a jumbo jet, which is just implausible.
Mm-hmm. Nathalie, thank you. Well, when we're on this complexity, I asked you in advance of this, both of you, is there an area that you just, as Christians, looking at a creation, kind of sit back in wonder? And Krista, you prepared something. So that's the question I asked in advance. And is there an area in which you just wonder at the majesty and complexity and the intricacy of this creation? If so, what?
Well, there is. So for me, as I said, I work on metabolism. And I think it's when I see the broad complexity of metabolism that I'm astounded. So I did bring a slide, which hopefully... So this company put together a diagram. They tried to get on one piece of paper all of the metabolic reactions that sustain human life. And this is what it looks like. You can't even read the words when it's zoomed out. So that, for me, just astounds me as to how much is going on to sustain
And have we got your little area highlighted?
So can you see those yellow bits? Yeah. So
that's you.
So I've worked on these 4 reactions for 4.5 years in one tissue, in one organism, in one context, and I've barely scratched the surface. So I think that shows me just how complex metabolism is. Let's
just zoom out again, have a look, and Nathalie's now going to recite the whole thing, left to right, top to bottom. That's remarkable. What about you, Nathalie?
I mean, for me, it is the human genome, which is obviously my area of work. And like I said, it's 3 billion letters that all have to be precisely ordered, and it's such a finely tuned mechanism that makes our bodies what they are and that they function properly. And those 3 billion letters are then packaged into genes, which then encode proteins, which then are part of complex biochemical reactions, and metabolism, like Krista's just shown, is just one of those. And that is happening in most of the cells in our body all the time. And it's just so finely tuned. And I just find that mind-blowing that actually each of us walking around, that's happening all the time, and in such a precise, fine-tuned way.
Yeah. You're obviously really passionate about your work. I mean, can you give us an example of what makes you so delighted to be in the area you're in, why you're so passionate about it?
I mean, I do just find the area fascinating to start with, but I think especially in my area of work, there are patients and there's families at the end of what I do. And some of them are very poorly, and some of them wait for a long time to get an answer for what's wrong with them. And I think with some of these complex genetic disorders, the doctors find it quite hard to actually give a clinical diagnosis, and it's only when you get a genetic diagnosis that actually the patient or the patient's families get an answer to what is wrong with them. And clinical counsellors will tell you that actually just having a name for what is wrong with you has such a big psychological impact. So I think knowing that I can help that to some extent is a really rewarding part of my work.
And you've been in the field for 20 years now, so things...
Give away my age, will you?
But things must have developed in an extraordinary way. Can you give us a sense of the scope?
Yes, this does make me feel old, because when I was thinking about this, I thought when I started out my career, the human genome had only just been mapped and sequenced. That took 13 years and cost nearly £3 billion. And Krista alluded to it earlier, the explosion in technology and how we can now sequence genetics has just literally been an exponential growth over the past, especially over the past 10 years. And we can now sequence a genome in a matter of days, and it costs less than £1,000. And that cost is actually just going down and down every day. So it's really transformed the way that we can do genetics and also interrogate human disease.
Yeah, fascinating. What about you, Krista? What makes you so passionate about it?
Yeah, well, I think in my field, a good example of the use of the little flies is, so everyone, all of us in our body, we have something on the surface of our immune cells and some other cells called toll-like receptors. And these are responsible for detecting bacteria. So they're one of the ways your body knows, oh no, I'm infected, I need to respond. And the reason they're called toll-like receptors is because they're named after the toll receptor, which was first found in the fly. So I think that's brilliant that somebody cloned this random gene in the fly, and then it turned out to be, conserved in humans and really fundamental to, a core part of the immune response. And that got the Nobel Prize in 2011. And so if we understand how the immune response functions, we then can understand how bacteria can overcome it, how we can develop therapies. So we have to thank the flies.
You've got them there. You're not going to let them out, are you?
No. This time I taped it.
You taped it round, and we'd have these mutant flies.
Yeah, exactly.
The size of houses suddenly descending upon us.
Some people, when I say I work with mutants, sometimes people say, what's the mutant superpower? And I have to tell them their superpower is they can't do one metabolic reaction. It's the most pathetic superpower.
So they're not. Now listen, we must draw to a close. I'm going to ask you two things just as we close. In a nutshell, if someone would say, in a nutshell, what is the Christian faith? And then why are you glad to be a follower of Jesus? Shall we start with you, Krista?
Yeah, so I think what I was talking about earlier about humans rejecting God, being under his judgment, the good news is the Bible doesn't end there. So the Bible tells a story in which God actually became a human, the person of Jesus. He died on the cross, and in doing that, he took the punishment that we deserve. And that means if we accept his death on our behalf, we can be forgiven of our sins, and we can relate to God again. So that's the brilliant news of the Christian faith. It doesn't mean we're now free from the pain and the difficulties of the broken creation, but God does promise that someday he will create a perfect new world where those who choose to relate to him can live. And hopefully, I wonder if the photoreceptors will be flipped around in the new creation. And I think that's kind of one of the best things about being a Christian is that we can actually relate to God again, to know that there is a God who knows me, who loves me, who has a plan for my life that I can speak to when I'm in the lab getting frustrated, somebody that's always there. I think that's a real privilege.
Mm-hmm. Nathalie, what about you? You've almost answered it already. Anything else you want to say in a nutshell? And then why you're glad to follow Jesus?
Yeah, I think one thing that's helpful sometimes to say is what Christianity isn't. Because I think sometimes people can get it wrong and think that Christianity is just about following a load of rules and regulations, and that actually God's out to spoil our fun. And it's completely the opposite. The Christian message is good news, and it's good news about a God who loves us, good news about a God who loves us enough to send Jesus to die for us so that we can know him. And the message is about following God and living a life that puts God at the centre rather than ourselves at the centre. And again, I think what some people can get wrong about that is that they think that's a bad thing. But actually, God's made us, he knows us intimately, and he ultimately knows the best way that we can live. And to answer the question, what makes me glad to be a Christian, I think there could be so many ways of answering that. But I think probably knowing that I'm unconditionally loved by God just as I am and not having to earn it. And I think particularly for me, I find living in a world where I see so many people, including myself when I get it wrong, striving for things that the world has to offer that promises joy and satisfaction and value. And I think we all, if we're honest, know that the world can't offer that. It's relative, it's empty. We can't ultimately find our happiness in things that this world has to offer. But actually, as a Christian, knowing that my joy and my satisfaction and my value comes from being made by God and being loved by him is an amazing thing.
I remember visiting a friend in Deutsche Bank one day, and alongside a Damien Hirst and an Anish Kapoor and various other bits of contemporary art, there was a huge dice. And it was a piece by a guy called Tony Cragg. And this was back in the mid-1990s, but I couldn't resist picking up the little leaflet, and I've kept it ever since. The piece is about the structure of the universe. The dice symbolize all the random choices that have been made in our evolution. I'm afraid I was slightly cheeky, and I said to my banker friend, "Is that how you do your financial decision-making?" Now, at the same time, there was a band from Romford, I think, called The Underworld, if we've got any fans of The Underworld here. And they were a very contemporary band in the mid-1990s. And I remember being awake in the middle of the night one night and going down, seeing a documentary and it happened to be on The Underworld. And they told us how The Underworld put together their lyrics. And apparently, on the way on the train out to Romford, they would just look at advertising hoardings and completely at random select words, and that became the lyrics of their songs. Now, maybe they've developed in their later period. They got a little bit more sophisticated. But here's our topic for this evening. Are we just a lucky number? Is it that the human race kind of hit the jackpot in the lotto of the universe? Or is there a God? And is it actually not simply random? There's only one spiritual leader who's ever claimed directly and personally to be God and been taken seriously in it, and that is Jesus Christ. And so what I want us to do as we make a start is, if you wouldn't mind picking up one of the eyewitness accounts that you'll find on the table there in front of you, and have a look at just a few sentences from some of the teaching of Jesus Christ. Now, the author of this account is a man called John. He is described in the account as the disciple whom Jesus loved. He's incidentally the disciple who lived the longest and the only disciple who was not martyred for his faith. If you turn to page 3, I'm going to read just the opening couple of sentences. You may find it familiar. In the beginning was the Word. The Word was with God. The Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of man. Now, the word there refers to Jesus. Notice the negative. Without him was not anything made that has been made. This is a direct claim that Jesus Christ is God, that Jesus Christ made everything, and that without Jesus Christ, I would not be able to take my next breath. In him was life, and that life was the light of the world. That Jesus Christ is the author of this creation, and that Jesus Christ is the end of this creation. Now, I know we've jumped right in at the deep end at this point, but that, after all, is what our evening is about. Straight away, you can see we've come to the right place, and we've got two options on the table. Is it all just random? The roll of the dice. As Jacques Monod, the French scientific philosopher, put it like this when he said, chance alone is the source of every innovation, of all creation in the biosphere. Pure chance. Absolutely free but blind. There's one option. And here's the other, that there is a creator, that he rules the universe, that we come from him, and we were made for him, and his name is Jesus. Now, I realize straight away we are in the deep end, and you'll be glad to know that John backs this claim up with evidence. And the whole of the account that you've got in your hand is designed, actually, to persuade us to believe. That's what John tells us in the very closing section of his account. These things were written that you may believe. And so what I want us to do is turn over a couple of pages to chapter 2 of the writing there, and sentences number 1 through 11. It's entitled The Wedding at Cana, and you find it on page 6. And I've asked Lou Gould, who is here somewhere, I hope, if she would stand up and read verses 1 through 12 for us.
On the third day, there was a wedding at Cana in Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Jesus also was invited to the wedding with his disciples. When the wine ran out, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." And Jesus said to her, "Woman, what does this have to do with me? My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Now there were 6 stone water jars there for the Jewish rites of purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. Jesus said to the servants, "Fill the jars with water." And they filled them up to the brim. And he said to them, "Now draw some out and take it to the master of the feast." So they took it. When the master of the feast tasted the water, now become wine, and did not know where it came from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew, the master of the feast called the bridegroom and said to him, "Everyone serves the good wine first, and when people have drunk freely, then the poor wine. But you have kept the good wine until now." This, the first of his signs, Jesus did at Cana in Galilee, and manifested his glory, and his disciples believed in him. After this, he went down to Capernaum with his mother and his brothers and his disciples, and they stayed there for a few days.
Well, Lou, thank you very much. And straight away, you can see what John is wanting to do for us here. He spells it out in the penultimate sentence. This, the first of the signs Jesus did at Cana in Galilee, and he manifested his glory, and his disciples believed him. And I think we have to admit that what Jesus does here is glorious. It's worth noting that this is recorded as history. John records for us the place. It's Cana of Galilee. It has all the hallmarks of eyewitness testimony. He tells us the day. It's the third day. The event, it was at a wedding. The detail, there were 6 stone water jars. They were of the type that was used for spirit ritual cleansing. Each held 20 to 30 gallons. And so we're told the conversation. We're given the mother's concern, Jesus' action. Of course, for a host at a wedding to run out of wine, it's acutely embarrassing. And you can imagine the scene. Weddings lasted, I'm told in those days, up to a week. But this is a supernatural event. Now, I've been closely involved with a number of weddings over the last few years. And so I've done the maths on this to see what actually happened. And there were 4.54 litres to a gallon. Each jar held 20 to 30 gallons. Let's imagine 25. There were 6 stone water jars. That's 681 litres of wine. And a bottle of wine holds 0.75 litres, unless you're one of the kind of guys that gets a Jeroboam. And that's over 900 bottles. So the sheer quantity is absolutely staggering. And then there's the quality. It was the groom's family who hosted the wedding in those days. And did you spot that the master of the ceremonies actually went to the groom? There in sentence number 10. And he says, everyone serves the good wine first, and when people are drunk freely, then the poor wine, but you have kept the good wine until now. Now, we know exactly what the master is talking about. I suspect some of us may have done it, some of us cheapskates like me. You've got a couple of the bottles of the good stuff, and so you serve that out first, and when everybody's not really noticing, then you bring out. But what Jesus does is at the end of this wedding feast, and it's no home brew Chateau Neuf de Lidl. It's not student bash, screw top, one glass, filthy headache kind of stuff. This is the finest Chateau Lafleur Petrus, clocking in at 674 quid a bottle at today's prices, and it's 75.5 cases of the stuff. And Jesus, with just a word, without any kind of physical intervention, he speaks, and it happens. So I hope you'll agree that it is glorious, and this is accounted as history, and Jesus did it. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. Well, actually, I know what some of you are thinking. Some of you are thinking, next time I have a party, I must try and make sure Jesus is there. But some of you may be saying, look, this is typical of an evening like this. It's all very well hearing from the two scientific experts, but now we get to the cookie stuff. And, this is kind of Alice in Wonderland, and, you expect me to believe 6 impossible things before breakfast. So can I ask you to consider for just a moment a few things about the evidence that we've got in our hands here? First, the scale of the incident, and if you like, those like them that John records. It's not the only such incident. In this eyewitness account, we read of Jesus turning water into wine, healing an official's son on the point of death, enabling a man who's been paralyzed for 38 years to walk, giving sight to a man who was born blind, raising a dead man who's been dead for 4 days and had begun to rot, and then himself being raised from the dead. And in each account, the individuals concerned are publicly witnessed and publicly known. I think about the square where I live, or the school where our kids went to school, or friends more widely. And there are certain individuals who've had lifelong ailments. We know them. These kind of things just don't happen, and they didn't happen then either. Sometimes we get into this idea that they were ignorant peasants. People didn't rise from the grave in the 1st century. It didn't happen then either. They lived in the same world as us. The evidence. And then secondly, may I ask you to consider the nature of the evidence. It's worth just pausing and pondering this, because I think people sometimes get in a bit of a muddle. Yeah, the evidence we are looking at is not scientific evidence. That is, it's not the kind of thing that's replicable in a test tube. Of course it isn't. This is historical evidence, courtroom testimony, and by definition, courtroom testimony, historical evidence, is not replicable. You can't, when a trial is going on, say to the judge, or have the judge say to you, well, let's pop back to the murder scene, shall we, and do it again and see if she really did it. It just doesn't work like that. So many people come to this sort of thing and they bring the kind of scientific evidential model rather than the historical evidence model. When it comes to the historical evidence model, you have to be asking the kind of questions that Krista was asking. Did it happen? Is this reliable? What about the eyewitnesses? And so forth. And then the third, if I might explore another line on the evidence, which has always struck me as slightly odd, and it's the area of logic. The idea that, there is no God, and therefore there's no such thing as the supernatural. And therefore, because there's no such thing as the supernatural, therefore miracles don't happen. And therefore, because miracles don't happen, Jesus can't have done them. And because Jesus can't have done miracles, therefore Jesus can't be God. And it's always struck me as being strangely circular. I've heard somebody describe it as scientific mysticism. Surely if there is a God, and if he did create this ordered world with its laws of physics and complex genetics and so forth, is it not absolutely reasonable that when he steps into his universe, he behave like this? Indeed, I might even put it like this. If he didn't behave like this, you might be the first person to come and complain to me. How can I possibly believe that he was God? Because he wasn't any different. So 3 little areas as we think about the evidence, which I hope you will agree is quite glorious. We've seen the quantity, we've seen the quality, we've looked at the nature of the evidence. And if Jesus is God, well, that changes absolutely everything. I'm not a random being. I can't actually walk unaccountably through this universe as master of my own destiny with nobody to answer to at the end. It changes absolutely everything. There is a God. He has entered into this world. He can be known. But I think there's more, because not only does this incident in its immediate detail suggest that Jesus is Lord of his creation, and we should bow to him, surrender to him, but it also suggests in its wider setting that Jesus can deliver on the promise of a new creation. And the point here is that Jesus did not come in a vacuum. He didn't come as a kind of bolt from the blue. He stepped into a matrix or a grid of understanding and expectation. May I say that's precisely what you would expect if God was going to make himself known. He would enable us to understand that he was coming and give us some sort of grid of interpretation for when he came. Marriage in the first part of the Bible is used not only to describe the relationship between a husband and a wife, but also the relationship between God and his people, God and humanity. And frequently God is described as the husband of his people. It's a beautiful image. It speaks of intimacy, of commitment, of faithfulness, and supremely, as we were hearing earlier, of love. And the promise through the whole of the first part of the Bible is that God will one day visit his people, and that on the day of his coming, it will be like a glorious marriage feast in which everything in this world that spoils the world is removed. It's, again, what we were hearing about earlier, love and a broken universe and God stepping into it. What I'd like to do is to ask Lou to read again, and this time from the first part of the Bible, Isaiah chapter 25. Just listen very carefully to this promise of the coming of God's King and of the new world that he's going to bring.
On this mountain, the Lord of hosts will make for all peoples a feast of rich food, a feast of well-aged wine, of rich food full of marrow, of aged wine well refined. And he will swallow up on this mountain the covering that is cast over all peoples, the veil that is spread over all nations. He will swallow up death forever, and the Lord God will wipe away tears from all faces, and the reproach of his people he will take away from all the earth, for the Lord has spoken.
Thanks, Lou, so much. Now, did you notice the feast there? Did you notice the well-aged wine, the rich food full of marrow, the shroud that covers all of humanity, that is the shroud of death? Did you notice death being removed? And did you notice tears being wiped from the eyes? It's a beautiful picture, isn't it, of God leaning forward and wiping away the tears from eyes. It's a glorious picture. Everything that spoils this world removed, disorder, disease, death itself in a wonderful new creation. And isn't it striking that the first miracle that Jesus does as he steps into the world then is at a marriage feast where he plays the part of the groom. It's as if he's saying, here I am, I have come. And the first thing he does is to turn water into the most glorious wine. This is the feast. The time has arrived. Now, I can imagine somebody saying, look, but it didn't work. I mean, how come I'm sitting here drinking Brewdog from a tin can or whatever it is they're serving tonight? I can't quite remember what it is, but surely it should be Chateau Lafeur and all the rest of it. Well, just glance down at the reading we had again on page 6 and have a look at this intriguing thing Jesus says to his mother. It's verse 4, sentence 4, about 3 or 4 lines down. Jesus said to her, woman, that was a normal term of address in those days. What does this have to do with me? My hour has not yet come. Now, really, we need to read the rest of this gospel to make sense of this sentence. But it is intriguing, isn't it? The hour is a theme that runs right the way through John's account, and Jesus frequently refers to his hour, and it refers first to his death on the cross, and secondly to his return, when he comes as judge. So first, his death on the cross. Do you know, I don't know if you ever thought, if there is a God, and if that God is Jesus, what would it take for me to be forgiven for the way that I've treated him? What would it take for him justly to be able to deal with all the offense that I have caused not only God, but also the way I've treated his creatures, my fellow men and women? How could he ever forgive me? And the rest of the account works through to the hour, and the hour is the hour when Jesus dies on the cross. And on the cross, he carries God's judgment that everything you and I have ever thought, said, and done that is wrong. And that enables a relationship to be reestablished between us and our Creator. And enables us then to walk through this world with God as our friend. And it enables us then to approach the hour, the return of Jesus and the feast, knowing that he is on our side and we are on his. Well, now you'd need to read the rest of the gospel, and I'd love you to do that. But I hope you can see, as we begin to think about this issue of, the origin of life, can I believe? Yeah, you really can. The evidence is there. There is a man, his name is Jesus. He was long expected. He stepped into this world. He really has delivered on what he promised he would deliver on. And I hope you might take the time to explore that some more for yourself. For myself, the day I came to realize that Jesus is God and surrendered to him, it changed everything for the better. And I would love that to be true for you as well.